Well, good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Uh, we'll go ahead and get started. On behalf of the Siburt Institute, I want to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn session on law enforcement chaplaincy. Our speaker is John Knox. He's from Granbury, Texas, and he'll introduce himself in just a minute. This is an area of chaplaincy that is known to some of you and maybe not known to others. The Siburt Institute, our mission really is to bring chaplains together. And that includes chaplains who are working in different subspecialties of chaplaincy. Many of the folks that are in this fellowship are healthcare chaplains, but there are also folks involved with law enforcement, chaplaincy, military chaplaincy, industrial chaplaincy, and other areas. And so part of the purpose of these lunch and learns is to expose us to perspectives from different of the chaplaincy world. Today's session is being recorded. My name is Paul Riddle, and for those of you who just joined, I'm Director of Spiritual Care for Lifeline Chaplaincy in Houston and serve on the steering committee for the Siburt Institute Chaplains Fellowship. So I'll be the host today. I do want to acknowledge also Renee Paul. She is our administrative support person at the Siburt Institute in Abilene. She is running the technical side of things, and the link that you got registered came from her. Also, I want to give you a heads up. I'm expecting a call at 1 o'clock. We'll probably be done by then, but if for some reason that call, comes early and I have to leave, Renee will close out the meeting. But hopefully I'll be able to stay with you the whole time. Our speaker, as I said, is John Knox. And John, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're in your hands.
Well, welcome to the world of law enforcement. In the past, I have done an introductory presentation on law enforcement chaplaincy. I've entitled it "Everything I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in the Front Seat of a Patrol Car." But you're going to enter a different culture today, so I think it's going to be really interesting. I hope that you find it really, really helpful. A little background on me. I've been in law enforcement chaplaincy. This month marks 34 years. I helped start the chaplaincy program for the police department in Wichita Falls in January of 1990. I have worked with the Texas Department of Public Safety, which includes both Highway Patrol and the Texas Rangers, since 2005, and then with Granbury PD since 2006. Had the opportunity to be a law enforcement instructor, really specializing in teaching crisis intervention training, which is required by this state for all police officers. And then in recent years, I've been invited to be a part of the crisis and hostage negotiation team, which is a part of our regional SWAT team. And then I'll talk about critical incident stress management, a little further detail as we go on this morning. So I want to talk, first of all, just in very general terms, the role of a police chaplain. And I think you'll find it in many ways, there'll be overlap as far as working, for example, in a hospital or clinical setting. But in other ways, it's going to be really different as well. One of the things I say in contrast, in a hospital, at least you're in sort of somewhat of a predictable setting where more variables are at your control. You're in the ER, you're in a hospital room or an ICU room. And chaplains, we do things out in the field as it unfolds, and that can be very fluid and very unpredictable as well. So let me give a little indication of what we do in terms of serving the community. I want to preface all of this by saying, as law enforcement chaplains, we never fly solo. Everything we do, we are partnered with an officer, and an officer is actually with us in our presence. We're with that person or with that group of officers on everything that we do. So here's a listing, not necessarily an order of frequency, but here's a listing of some of the things that we partner with an officer. A very frequent call out for us where an officer would call us to a scene is an unattended death, or as the terminology that we would use is a DOS, a deceased on scene. Frequently, a person will die at home or they die in some other context, some non-clinical setting that necessitates an investigation. So a quick example I would use, I recall a call out one time where an 18-year-old girl came home and she found her father deceased in his home, and he had been there for a couple of days. So naturally, she was very distraught. The officers ensued their investigation, and they've called me to take care of her, to provide some pastoral care for that 18-year-old girl as they conducted their investigation. We're called the suicide scenes. Completed suicides is what I'm making reference to here. As most of you are aware, we're in a very serious mental health crisis in this country. Our number of suicides in Hood County, where I serve, has spiraled this year. I believe in 2023, we approached 30 completed suicides, which is statistically is up substantially from previous years. We do have calls where there's been a homicide. We're on a lake in Granbury. We're on Lake Granbury, so we unfortunately have drownings every summer. So that's a unique situation in several different ways. Fatality car crashes that occur in our county. Granbury's like a lot of communities that surround the DFW Metroplex. The traffic here has really outgrown the infrastructure. And so that's one of the consequences of that is very serious crashes. Other accidental deaths, if you can, an industrial related death, or maybe something, an agriculturally related death, some kind of accidental death. And then benevolent situations. And all this that serve in ministry have been involved in benevolence in various ways. And I've always told my colleagues at church, if an officer calls you at 2:00 in the morning because they're needing some kind of benevolent assistant for a person they're serving, you can count on it. That individual has been well vetted, and you can count on it. It's very worth your time to get up at 2:00 in the morning and go assist that officer to serve that citizen. And then probably one of our most common call outs is to deliver death notifications, whether it's a death notification as a result of an event that actually occurred in our city or in our county, or it could be another scenario that someone died in an unexpected way out of state or out of county, and that out of state agency notified us and have asked us as a police department to go in person to deliver that notification. And that's the key on notifications. We really try our best. The very absolute last resort is to do a notification on the phone, always in person. A couple of things I'll mention about death notifications real quickly. Two things that have changed over my 34-year career. One is family structure is so different than it was 34 years ago. It's where you would have had automatically, for example, you'd be searching for a spouse. And in many cases, someone's had multiple partners and you don't know who that person was with at the time of their death. And so it turns into a very complicated situation finding, even if they're not next of kin, just finding someone close to that person that you can notify. The second thing about death notifications that has changed is what I call the Facebook race. We're on a race against time, hoping that somebody posting an event on social media, for example, a fatality car crash, that they don't post that before we get to a family. Sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not. Or someone will text an individual and say, oh, looks like that was your wife's car that was involved in this terrible crash at this particular location. So the officers and I call it the Facebook race. We want to get there as promptly and efficiently as we possibly can because we want to notify that family in a manner that's compassionate and professional and not by social media. So just a couple of examples. This was a call out that I responded to on February the 25th, 2022. A man killed his stepdaughter, his biological daughter, who was this little girl right here, killed his wife, and then killed himself. It came out as a check welfare call. We sent two very young officers. One of them was a rookie that didn't even have a year's experience on yet, who discovered this horrible scene. As you can imagine, officers in their early 20s who have never had an experience like that. It impacted them dramatically emotionally. So they called me to the scene initially to be supportive of these young officers who were obviously reeling from what they just witnessed and what they were involved in. But additionally, I was responsible for actually going to another city nearby in the Fort Worth area to notify this little girl's grandma and her mother's mom of what had occurred. So, as you can imagine, it's not a daily type event, but it was intense. And it's one of those kind of events that lingers with our officers. You know, you don't go home and everything's back to normal, very quickly. It's very emotionally challenging responding to these kind of situations. Another example from 2008 that still stands out to us: Alyssa Dix was killed in a car crash on March the 2nd, 2008. She was with her two sisters. The three of them were on their way to evening events for their youth group at their church when they were killed in what was truly an accident. And Alyssa's parents showed up on the scene as the officers were investigating, and I had an opportunity to get well acquainted with them. And one of the things that stands out to me about this particular situation, the investigating officers who were first on scene took time on their day off to attend this young lady's funeral, which deeply impacted her parents. And I accompanied them to that funeral. And it's just an indication of I'm working with people who are true servants, who do things on their own time, who spend money out of their own pocket to help people, and are sometimes not portrayed accurately by our media. This was an interesting, we had a drowning at the city beach in Granbury in July 2018. And here's one of the challenges we had. On a drowning, it's not always real straightforward because you're searching for a body, and sometimes that can take 2 or 3 days before a recovery is made. And in this situation, the family did not speak English. And so we had to work through a translator that could translate into Spanish on behalf of this family. So we had the challenge of waiting as they search for a recovery, and at the same time trying to communicate love and concern, having a language barrier. But one of the things I'll always say is love is the universal language. And if you care about people and you're expressing compassion, even if you don't speak very good Spanish, it just has a way of coming across. And I know those of you who are serving in different areas of chaplaincy are very aware of that fact. Some of you may or may not know, we had a tornado here on May the 15th, 2013. So it's been over 10 years ago now. These are three of our officers who still work for the police department. Sergeant Michael Hawley on the left is a patrol sergeant. Richard Branham in the middle is now a detective. And Richard Duckett on the far right is a patrol officer and also serves as our regional SWAT commander as well. If I remember correctly, we had a total of 6 fatalities as a consequence of the tornado. This was an all hands on deck. The tornado hit on a Wednesday night. In fact, I remember being in church that night, and the tornado hit right after church was dismissed, completely destroyed one neighborhood in particular. There were 100 homes that were completely destroyed and a number of other homes that had damage. What I recall about the tornado, it was so good that the church had a natural partnership already formed with law enforcement agencies. So we were able to use the gym at our congregation as a basis for all the nonprofits like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army and the fire marshal's office and all these representatives to set up in our gym to provide immediate assistance to those that were impacted by the tornado. But all that occurred because there was already a meaningful partnership, both with the police department and along with the sheriff's office and the highway patrol too. As I look back on 2013, I think all the church did was tornado relief for a full year, from May 13 to May of 14. And I know we did normal church things that churches do. I just don't remember. All I remember from 2013 is doing a lot of ministry, helping people get their lives reestablished after, in some cases, losing their home and losing everything. And that solidified our partnership with law enforcement. And again, these officers are genuine servants who rose to the occasion and did an outstanding job in May of 2013. So I want to talk a little bit about law enforcement culture because it's unique. And I realize working in a hospital is also a unique setting, or if you're working as an industrial chaplain, working in your unique context, has its own culture as well. But law enforcement culture is especially unique. And I think in some ways there's some misperceptions. So as I think about doing ministry with police officers, again, the ministry is two-sided. There is that side to the community that I've just presented, that we're doing death notifications, we're responding to suicide scenes and things of this nature. But another huge piece of the ministry is providing good pastoral care for our officers and our civilian employees as well. But coming into that culture new, it's at least it was for me when I came in. I was the youngest chaplain in 1990 in Wichita Falls. I was 27 years old when I started in January of 1990. I guess I've come full circle because I'm now the second oldest person in the department. The chief is older than me. And by the way, I don't remind him of that fact. As far as he's concerned, I'm the oldest. But when I came in 1990, it was a little bit of a culture shock, and it took me some time to learn and to adapt well. So some characteristics of law enforcement culture, a lot of this you're probably aware of, but I think you'll find it interesting. Cops work under constant scrutiny. I know my boys, I have 3 sons, and growing up, they felt like as preachers' kids, they were under constant scrutiny. They felt like they lived in a glass house. But that was really nothing. Officers are working under constant scrutiny in the sense that everything they do and everything they say is being recorded. There are dash cams on patrol cars. The officers are now wearing body cams. And if their body cam or their dash cam didn't pick up what was said and done, a fellow officer who is also on that same call, their dash cam or their body cam, may pick that up. So therefore, the scrutiny is constant. Everything you say and everything you do. So let's think about those of us who are in ministry. What would it be like in a church context, for example, if you were walked around 24/7? Everything you say and everything you do is being recorded all the time. So that scrutiny is not ending. Of course, it was different when I started in 1990. And when I tell my younger officers now, when I started in 1990, there were no cameras. And of course, they look at me like I'm a dinosaur, but that's going to shift over this 34-year career. So as a consequence of video and everybody, of course, having iPhones and having the ability to record with an iPhone or video with an iPhone, media distortions are common. And so what you see in the media, so if you see it in national news or local news, you're seeing a little snippet. You're seeing a 20 or 30-second snippet of a video when what occurred may have been something 30 or 45 minutes or longer. So you're just getting a little teeny tiny piece when there's a lot more that occurred. And so it's distorted because you're not getting the whole story. And that's frustrating to an officer because it could be that their character is being questioned, or maybe even their character, to go as far to say their character is being assassinated. Everything's distorted because the whole story is not being told. So that's as a consequence, that adds to the culture of caution, officers being cautious, and I'll develop that a little more here in just a moment. I know this comes as a great shock, and I hope everybody is sitting down. People frequently lie to the police. And I would even say, from my experience of spending hours and hours riding along on shift with patrol officers, even when it'd be a whole lot easier to tell the truth, people still are not always truthful or don't tell everything that needs to be told. And I think that shapes an officer's perception of people in general. It's really easy to become a little jaded because it's so common. You're dealing with even a person who would be characterized normally as a good citizen is not being entirely truthful about the situation. And so when that happens day in and day out, I think really affects that officer. It affects their perception of humans in general. No surprise that we're dealing with a culture repelled by authority. Um, One of the things that's striking to me, and again, I'm basing this on my experience of doing a lot of ride-alongs, even on something simple as a traffic stop. And I'm thinking of a person who is a professional in a community. You're stopping an individual because they're speeding or there's some other sort of traffic infraction, and that officer stops in to talk to them about this violation. And to see an individual that's a professional, and Granbury's small enough, it could be a professional that I actually know, and to see how blatantly rude and disrespectful they are for no reason still surprises me. I'm still taken back by that when there's really no reason to be so rude. But in general, that mindset of being repelled by authority, and that's not obviously exclusive to law enforcement. I know educators experience that, and a lot of other people experience that. So, as a consequence of all the above and more, for an officer, socializing with normal citizens is a challenge. Now, that may be a challenge to define who is a normal citizen, who's normal anymore. But so I would paint the scenario of an officer going to a barbecue. And since many of us are in ministry, let's say that the officer's going to a church barbecue, and they start having just a nice, pleasant, casual conversation with somebody who's in attendance at the barbecue, and that person finds out they're a police officer, and the conversation is going to go somewhere like this. They're going to tell that officer, share that officer about a negative encounter they had, frequently as a consequence of a traffic stop, or their cousin Eddie is in prison and their cousin Eddie shouldn't be in prison, and the officers were wrong. And they're going to get these long and drawn out stories about encounters that they have had with the police, or they want a ticket fixed, or they want some other kind of favor, or there's a major case that our department is in the process of working, and they want to pump that officer for information, so to speak. They want to be in the know. Well, what do you know about this major case? And obviously, they can't discuss any of that. It's all confidential. So I tell my officers that sounds a little bit like being a preacher. That sometimes for us socializing with normal citizens, the challenges are strikingly similar. And when I tell an officer that our roles are similar, they always laugh at me. And then when I explain the similarities, they stop laughing and they get it. So in some ways, our roles are very similar in terms of just being in social settings. So there again, a consequence, law enforcement culture is characterized by caution. Police officers are slow to warm up socially to people outside their circle. And one of the things that I try to tell young officers when they get out of the academy and they begin their career, they're with their field training officers, is encourage them to continue to have meaningful social relationships with people outside of law enforcement. Now, in many cases, that goes in one ear and out the other because of the things that I've just described. It's really tempting for police officers to associate, socially speaking, outside of work exclusively with other police officers, because it becomes there's two kinds of people in the world. There's police officers and bad guys. Well, the truth is that's not accurate. That's not true. But unfortunately, that can become the perception. And so law enforcement culture is characterized by culture just because of the way that people interact. And can you really trust this person who's outside of your law enforcement social circle? I think the officers that stay engaged in church and remain engaged despite the challenges that shift work brings, if they can remain engaged in their church community, I think those officers do a lot better. Their career is healthier, they're happier, and they're just more balanced socially. So the illustration I would use is the challenge of a meal break on duty. And so that, those of us who are not working in law enforcement, who have just a regular job, you have your lunch hour, and your lunch hour is from 12 to 1. And if you want to go meet a friend for lunch, you go meet your friend for lunch. And, even if you have a little flexibility, professionally speaking, that lunch may last an hour, hour and a half, or even longer. So for a police officer to take a meal break, first of all, they're subject to call. So they check out, let's say they checked out at a local fast food restaurant, and they check out to get their hamburger or their chicken sandwich. And they take one bite out of their chicken sandwich, and a priority one call goes out. There is an injury accident, or there is a fight in progress call. And I can remember on several occasions, one that stands out to me. I remember going into a sit-down restaurant with the officer I was riding with. Great mom and pop restaurant. We ordered chicken strips, and they're homemade, and they looked really good. And the waitress brought us our chicken strips. And we got one, maybe two bites, and a priority one call went out. He said, "We got to go." And I'm looking at my chicken strips sort of longingly. We paid our bill. We got one or two bites, and that was the end of our dinner plans for the night. So that's one challenge of a meal break. You take one or two bites of your chicken sandwich, and off you go. The second challenge is security. Even in a place like Granbury, America, security, sitting in a fast food restaurant or sitting in a sit-down traditional restaurant, always watching the door. You're going to sit at the back of the restaurant with your back to the wall, and you're going to pay attention because you don't know what the intent is of someone walking in that restaurant and how they could potentially harm you or harm other patrons in that restaurant. Security is a very real concern. And as you know, officers have been killed in such circumstances in the fairly recent past. The third challenge would be you're in there, again, you're having a meal, maybe you're with another officer, maybe you're a couple of other officers, and citizens feel very free to come up and engage you in conversation, even though you have this very short time for lunch. Again, same scenario. They want to come and talk about the ticket they got, or they want to talk about something else that they're upset with the police department about, or they're upset with a police department in a completely different city. And they want to take 10 or 15 minutes of your time, which is perfectly okay. But we probably wouldn't do that to someone else. And I realize they're on duty and they understand that, but that's just the challenge of a meal break on duty. I think the most frustrating thing to an officer when they're on a meal break is when a parent who has a young child in tow, let's say they have a 4-year-old child in tow, and they'll say, "No, Johnny, be sure to behave yourself, or this police officer is going to take you to jail," or something to that effect, where they're creating fear about an officer in front of this young child. And the officers want a child to feel like they can trust them, they can go to them, and they are safe people. And that's really discouraging and very unhelpful. But I'm speaking from experience of having eaten a jillion meals over the years with police officers, for lunch and dinner and breakfast for that matter. That is a very common occurrence. So back to what the slide where I was talking about police officers, or rather police chaplains, serving the community. Let's look at those same calls through the lens of an officer. And the best way I know to describe that is police officers deal with people who have real problems. So your loved one commits suicide in your home, and unfortunately, that's very common in terms of completed suicides. Or your loved one has been the victim of a homicide. So this officer is not only conducting an investigation, they're also working with people whose lives have literally been turned upside down. Or the way I describe it, as a chaplain and the officers, both of us are encountering people and serving people on the very worst day of their life. And we embrace that. We know that's a reality, and we're we try to be especially compassionate and empathetic as a consequence. We know that's, we know that's the situation they're in. Both injury and fatality car crashes are also, this family is never going to be the same. You have an individual's driver's license in your hand, and I've experienced this. I've had somebody's driver's license in my hand, and this person's now deceased. And I'm in the front seat of a patrol car, and we're on our way to this person's home to notify their relatives. And before you get there, in a matter of seconds, I'm going to turn this person's world upside down. This is going to be unexpected. This is their child. This is their spouse. It's very challenging, and that person has real problems, not perceived problems. Same is true for unattended deaths. A person comes home and they found their loved one is deceased. I put family violence and mental health concerns in italics because these are calls that police officers are taking every day, all day. And that would be the case of both day shift and night shift. A lot of departments have gone to, as far as patrol officers have gone to 12-hour shifts. Our officers do 12-hour shifts. So for the most part, our officers do a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. evening shift, means 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. We also have some overlap. We have some coming in earlier or leaving earlier during the night. But day shift or night shift, family violence is ongoing. It's an ongoing challenge, whether it's an outright assault where someone in the family has been physically assaulted, or if it's just verbal. That's really challenging. And they find an officer finds himself in the position of being what I would characterize more of a role of social worker counseling than law enforcement. You're trying to referee these situations and bring a sense of peace to very intense scenarios. Mental health concerns, I think if you ask me what has changed the most in the 34 years that I've been involved in this ministry, I think mental health concerns have just escalated tremendously. In our county, we're approaching 80,000 people. We're growing very rapidly. We have 2 deputies at the sheriff's office who are devoted exclusively to making mental health calls. They are referred to as mental health officers or mental health deputies. They've gotten specialized training that's offered for police officers in the state of Texas. That's all they're doing. So if a person is, if there's suicide ideation, for example, that mental health deputy is going to make that call, and they're going to partner with the mental health agencies in the state to secure necessary assistance for that individual. One of the things I appreciate about our mental health deputies, they're really good about doing follow-up work. They'll actually go to somebody's home and follow up with them. And it's the equivalent of me going and visiting somebody in a pastoral way, making a pastoral visit. I'm doing a follow-up with a church member. And it's very similar. And I've been on some of these visits with them, and it's been really inspiring to watch them in action because they're very kind and they know the system so well that if I'm trying to get someone help, I can call one of these mental health deputies and they know how to navigate the system. And that's really, really helpful. But police officers making mental health calls all day long, all night long, 7 days a week. And that's been a big shift over the last several years. Abused and neglected children. Again, in our county, we have 3 full-time investigators in the DA's office. They're a special task force. Those 3 investigators are investigating sexual abuse against children exclusively. That's all they're investigating. 3 full-time investigators, and their caseload is so overloaded they can't keep up. So every day they're serving abused and neglected children, and they're also, of course, investigating potential or real perpetrators. So that's a challenge too. As far as you want to talk about real problems, that is, I don't think it gets more serious. Even in Granbury is is a nice retirement community. We're on the lake. There's a lot of affluence here, but we're a unique community in that in Granbury, there's a lot of affluence, but there's also a tremendous amount of poverty too. And so we're working with people who are homeless. And the unique thing about a smaller community like Granbury is we don't have the same resources that a larger city like Fort Worth or Dallas would have as far as shelters and other resources like that. So we sometimes have to stand on our head to figure out what we're going to do to serve such individuals. Agency assist, such as the fire department, you're partnering with other agencies, you're partnering with EMS, you're partnering with a fire department. And again, you're dealing with people who have real problems. I just want to show some images just to help us think. So in this picture, you're probably naturally drawn first to the little girl. She's scared, isn't she? Now, when I see this picture, I see it through a different lens. I see the little girl and I feel tremendous concern for her, but I also look at that SWAT operator. And I'm sure he's young. And it occurs to me that he could have a child about that age at home. He could even have a little girl that age at home. And I wonder what he's thinking. And I more specifically wonder, what is he thinking and what is he feeling when his shift ends and this call out ends? And of course, if SWAT's out and a SWAT operator is holding a little girl, you know it's not good. Something has happened that's very serious. So I think about the spiritual and emotional welfare of that officer. Similar here. What is this officer thinking about at the end of her shift? And I would encourage you to look at her eyes and look very closely at this picture. Look at, just take note of the look on her face. This is obviously a very, very small child. What's the backstory? And what's going to be on her heart? What is she going to be thinking about when her shift ends and she goes home? And likely she has a family too. It's possible that she has children. What are they thinking? What are they feeling? This is a DPS sergeant, and I think you can well imagine what he has just done. This appears to me to be a scenario where someone drove up on a scene and the trooper is, we call this playing defense instead of offense. The trooper is having to respond instead of going to someone's home. He's obviously, the sergeant has obviously told this woman some horrible news. And you can even sense by his hand on her arm his kindness and his concern for her. And I would pose the same question. I obviously am concerned about this woman who's had a terrible loss, but I think about him and I think about what is he experiencing when he goes home at the end of the shift. And of course, he's a sergeant, so he's supervising the other troopers who are investigating that crash or investigating whatever that incident happened to be. So obviously, as these things that I've showed you both visually and also just a little bit of a bulleted list of things that officers do, there's stress in law enforcement. Family concerns are unique in law enforcement, partially because of shift work and partially because, and I'm thinking of young officers especially, and I'll just use a male officer just for the purposes of example. You're taught in the academy, you're taught by your field training officers to have command presence, that you have to take charge of the situation. You've got to, in some cases, place this person in arrest and put him in jail, or you've got to make sure this situation is secure. You've got to make sure you're safe and the citizens that you're serving are safe. So you go home to your sweet wife and you've only been married a couple of years, I mean, in their early 20s, and you get in command presence with your wife and you start being as firm and strong with her, or maybe interrogating her like you would interrogate someone who has potentially committed a crime. You can well imagine how that impacts a marriage. And I think that's probably where a, a large percentages of divorces occur among law enforcement officers is that very thing, learning how to readjust to normal socializing, even with your own spouse when you've been on the streets working. An officer really needs someone they can talk to, confidential communication. They're seeing so much, they're experiencing so much, and that's one of the services that the chaplain can provide is confidential communication. I frequently tell an officer, especially the first time I ride out with them or the first time I have a meaningful conversation with them in the building, that there's few sacred things left in this world. And one of the few sacred things left in this world is pastoral confidentiality. And I explain pastoral confidentiality, and I explain what the exceptions are to pastoral confidentiality. And of course, they'll test you. They'll tell you things, and they'll see if it's going to come back. See if it's going to be discussed around the department. I've been tested before, but once they really know that you're a confidential ear, I found they tell all, and there's a lot of trust. It just takes a long time. And I would back up the family concerns. Part of my role is to be of assistance, especially being the age I am. That's one time, or being the old guy helps, that you can provide some insight based on years of experience. I find the officers are very, very open to spiritual counsel. Years ago, I rode out with an officer, and he was asking me some questions about scripture. And so I had a pocket Bible in my back pocket. We're in the patrol car doing right along. I pulled out my pocket Bible. He was kind of stunned. You brought your Bible with you. And I looked at him. I said, John, I said, do you ever go out in the street unarmed? And he said, well, of course not. And I said, I don't either. I always bring my sword with me too. And so we got a good laugh, but they're very open to spiritual counsel, having meaningful conversations, especially when you're dealing with so much trauma and so much tragedy. A legitimate question that an officer poses is, where is God? When a little 4-year-old girl is a victim of a homicide, where is God? Where is he in all this? And how can we engage in that conversation? Work-related stress of all kinds, as you can well imagine, this is an intense environment, and intense environments lead to stress. We have officers that experience on-the-job injuries of a variety of kind. This job can be very physical, and sometimes when there's a physical altercation, of course, they do everything they can to not find themselves in a physical altercation, but sometimes you have no choice, and that can lead to injuries. And of course, line of duty deaths. Now, I said I would revisit this. Critical CISM, as we call it for short, critical incident stress management. And you can be certified in CISM to do both group debriefings and what we call one-on-one debriefings. Now, this is a mouthful. If you want to jot this down, the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. I'll repeat that. The International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. They offer training and certification in CISM. Now, they have certified instructors in police departments and fire departments. So it could be in your local community. You could go to a police department or a fire department, or in sometimes the Red Cross even offers CISM training. On a major event, not every call, but when an officer experiences a major event, we find that doing a critical incident debrief provides some very effective emotional first aid. It's not the cure-all, but we try to do a debriefing no later than 48 hours after the critical incident occurred. So, for example, on the murder-suicide I showed you where the little girl was killed, 48 hours after that event, every officer that was on that call, we did a group debrief. I will say in general, from my experience, I've worked with fire departments and EMS personnel as well as police officers. I think as a general rule, fire personnel, firefighters, and EMS personnel characteristically are very open to doing a group debrief. Police officers, I think, are far more open to one-on-one, where it's just you, just the chaplain and the officer, or somebody else in that officer. I think they're not as inclined to want to participate in a group debrief as firefighters are. I think that's a significant cultural difference between the two disciplines. Now, here's the fun part. This is what we get to do. Okay, we're chaplains. This is what we get to do. As far as I call this serving the servant. As I mentioned, we get to do ride-alongs, whether I can go and ride along for a couple hours or ride along for the whole shift. Frequently, what I will do, I'll go. We have a briefing at 6 a.m. in the morning. I'll go in at 6 a.m., attend the briefing, go have breakfast with those officers, and ride along till say 9 o'clock, and go to the office at 9. So that's giving me 3 hours. Or I'll ride in the evening, start the shift at 6 p.m. And I found as I age, when I come in the evening, seems to be getting earlier and earlier. But once they get you out at night, they're reluctant to bring you back because they really enjoy the company. Just shared meals. I'll call an officer and say, when are you taking your meal break? Do you want to meet somewhere and have a meal break together? I show up at the PD just to stick my head in the door, especially with the investigators, since they tend to spend more time in their office. Stick my head in the door and spend some time visiting. I find that some of my best conversations take place in the hallway or in the gym or in the squad room, just having very casual visits, but end up being meaningful. Community PD events where they do, national night out, various things, reaching out to kids, things like that. Serving officers' families. Sometimes there's an illness in the family, there's a birth of a child, or there's some need in their family. You're reaching out to one of their children, or you're reaching out to a spouse, and that's a pretty common thing. We provide pastoral care during injury or illness, just like we would for a church member, hospital visits, things of that nature. And I do have supervisor requests where a sergeant, for example, will say, hey, this officer over here is going through a tough time in his family, or this officer over here, we had to discipline that officer because there were some problems of conduct. Would you be willing to reach out to him? Would you be willing to maybe quietly go right out with him, not make a big deal about it, but just show up and reach out to that person? That's a fairly common thing. And of course, we provide pastoral counseling. One of the things I did, I was just kooky enough to go back to school when I was 52 and did a second master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. I did it specifically to enhance my chaplaincy role. So I mentioned getting called out. Can I eat first? So here's a great story, and I'll try to tell it very quickly. Several years ago, some of the ladies at the church I serve asked me what they could do to enhance my chaplaincy efforts. And so I told them a story about, hey, you go into a restaurant, you order your food, and all of a sudden you get a priority call and you got to go. And I said, so if you could serve a meal every once in a while, that'd be really nice. Just a home-cooked meal at church. And I said that the officers would feel comfortable coming to the church knowing they're not going to get the police special for lunch. Sometimes you go into a fast food place and you look behind the counter and you've arrested everybody that works in that fast food restaurant, and you really don't want the police special for lunch. So they don't have to worry about that at church. So the ladies got back to me and they said, we're going to do that. We like your idea of a meal. We're going to do it on Tuesday. I said, great. I need a date. What Tuesday did you have in mind? And they said, no, John, you don't understand. We're going to do it every Tuesday. To which I told them, you're crazy. Well, that was over 9 years ago. So every Tuesday during the school year, we serve approximately, on average, 80 to 85 first responders in our county, including the district judges, the justice of the peace, office personnel, EMS personnel, fire personnel, police personnel, constables, DPS troopers, everybody. And they come to the church and eat from 11 to 1. They have a home-cooked meal. The church has embraced this as a significant ministry. And so that's why I say the call's going out, can I eat first? And they know our ladies will reheat their plate if they have to go on a call and come back. So very quickly, who are these people called cops? I'm firmly believe they generally want to help people. And for those of us who have theological education, you'll appreciate this. They're action-oriented and have little patience for the theoretical or philosophical. Their professional interest area, you have officers obviously interested in things like SWAT, or they want to be in investigations, or they're interested in being a school resource officer. There's so many different ways they can go. I'm convinced they understand teamwork in a way that most people can't comprehend. And I also would add, I think that those of us in church ministry could benefit tremendously by observing the teamwork and the manner in which they conduct themselves. And they see and experience far more than you could possibly comprehend. This is Officer Chase Miller. If you'll search on YouTube, Chase Miller, Granbury Police Department, Chase was on regular patrol one night. A call went out that a little boy was not breathing in the parking lot of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Chase was about 100 yards from Kentucky Fried Chicken when the call went out. He pulled into the Kentucky Fried Chicken parking lot less than a minute after the call dropped, and immediately began CPR on this little boy. This was at a city council meeting where Chase was able to present this little boy some gifts, and also Chase was presented with the life-saving award by the Granbury Police Department. Chase is our corporal with us on night shift. He's really a great guy. And then finally, the ultimate sacrifice. I've worked several line of duty deaths over the years. Sergeant Lance McLean here in our own county was killed. He actually was shot by a accused pedophile protecting a family on June the 28th, 2013, and he died the next day on June the 29th, 2013. Lance was a friend of mine, deeply affected all of us, and I would say still does deeply affect all of us. And there's two real sketchy characters right there. Steve Quinn is my chaplain partner at the police department, and then the sheriff's office also has some chaplains. So I think I have allowed exactly 5 minutes here at the end for questions.
Yes, John, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Dennis Sauce here from Hebron, Connecticut, chaplain for Connecticut State Police, Troop K out of Colchester, Connecticut. Do you have any books or resources that you would recommend for those that want to develop their skills in law enforcement?
One that's not related to chaplaincy, but I think it's not directly related, but it's a must read for every police officer. It's entitled Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. It's been reprinted very recently. It was out of print for several years, and it was just very recently reprinted. Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. The author is Kevin Gilmartin, Gilnartin, Gilmartin. I think it's an absolute must read for every police officer. And it's a great book to have a discussion with your officer with. You're doing a ride along, you're talking. I recommended it to an officer just a few months ago, and he got on to me. He said, "Why didn't you give this to me years ago?" I said, "I tried." So there's a couple books on chaplaincy. If you'll send me your email, I will send you a kind of a listing, a little biography of books on. There's been several books on chaplaincy, and I'm not sure which ones are still in print.
Will do. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Hey, John,
Yes, sir.
will you give the name of the organization again? The International Critical Incident.
Yes, and it's International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and their website is thoseletters.org. It's like ICSF or whatever.org.
Okay.
The other organization I would recommend is International Conference of Police Chaplains, and their website is ICPC, the number 4, 4cops.org. ICPC, 4cops.org.
John, I don't know if you see that question in the chat. But they're wondering how they can reach you if we have further questions.
Yeah. So would it be helpful if I typed, or can we send out my email and contact information?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll be emailing everyone who registered already too with a copy of the
Phone
recording.
number, if they want to call me, that if that's easier to call me, that would be fine too.
Sure. Yeah. So I can include your contact info when I send that.
Chief Baker is with us. He's very supportive of the chaplain program in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He's chief of police there. Hey, Chief.
Good to see you, John. Good to hear from you.
See you too, sir. Been very fortunate to serve under police chiefs that have been incredibly supportive, which is certainly the case with our chief here. He's been chief for 18 years, been at the department since 1990, and he's a champion of police chaplaincy. Scott Meyer is going to bring his crew from Temple, Texas to Granbury to observe our first responder lunch later this month and see what we're doing. So just, I don't mean to make anybody jealous, but we are having smoked meatloaf for our next Tuesday first responder lunch, that's the officer's favorite. So to start a new year, our chef is smoking meatloaf for him.
Sounds good. We are at the top of the hour. And John, I want to thank you for this excellent presentation, for sharing of your experience and providing a window for those who aren't in law enforcement chaplaincy to have more understanding of this branch of our profession. I do want to make one plug for future events. Our next Lunch and Learn will be Thursday, April 4th. James Denham, who is a chaplain at the Texas Children's Hospital here in Houston, will be our presenter. His topic will be announced later on July 11th, which will be a week later than our usual time due to the Independence Day holiday. Wesley Erickson, who's the director of mission and ministry at Hendrick Hospital in Abilene, will be our speaker, and his topic also will be announced. On October 3rd, Dwayne Lee, who is Director of Chaplaincy Services at Terrell State Hospital, be talking about Church of Christ, non-denominational, interfaith, multi-faith, and Church of Christ, interfaith ministry. I'm going to have to go, but thanks to all of you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.